Here's one for you. So I just drove by a house and it's the home of a funeral director, a couple of kilometres back. And I know him from around the area. He's been a funeral director for as long as I've been alive, I'm sure. And it reminded me of something. It reminded me of my desire, for want of a better term. I'm not sure how I feel with the word desire in this context, but my want / desire / ambition to be present for the preparing of a body, if that's even the right term. Because as I understand it, a good bit goes into it. So, for example, when a human being dies, or when any animal dies, you know, depending on your spiritual / religious persuasion, I think the majority of people think that the soul, you know, whatever that is, leaves the body, and what you're left with after a person dies is just the body. The mind is no longer present, the soul, if that's your shtick, isn't present, and it's just your corpse, your physical body. And like with any animal, when it dies, as far as I'm aware at least, the very split second that you are clinically dead, say, your body starts to decompose. So for example, if you stumble across an animal in the wild that's been dead for a couple of days, odds are it will be bloated. And that's because the acids and various different substances in your stomach keep producing gases, essentially. So a corpse, a dead body, will burp and fart as that pressure builds up and pushes out in either direction. There's actually a great video of a sperm whale. I think, if memory serves me correctly, it was dragged into a harbour and they have to dispose of the body. But you can't just, you know, chuck it in a coffin and bury it in the ground. This thing is, I don't know how many tens of tons it is, but it's a monstrous big thing. But this particular sperm whale had been dead for God knows how long and was quite inflated. And the video that I'm mentioning, you can look it up. If you look up sperm whale explodes or sperm whale or whale explodes, two videos are likely to come up. One is a whale that was washed up on the beach somewhere in America. Again, huge big thing. It was rotting, it stank, it was going to pollute the beach and all the rest of it. So in typical American fashion, they decided the best thing to do would be to stick half a ton of dynamite under it and blow it to bits, which they did relatively successfully. What they weren't counting on were the, 50 kilo chunks of blubber, etc., that got blasted into the sky and landed on parked cars in the vicinity. It was dangerous. It was a miracle nobody was killed. And they have footage of the explosion and footage of the aftermath of smashed cars, basically. So that's a video that's likely to come up, but it's not the one I'm referencing. The other one I'm referencing is the sperm whale that, as I said, I think it was dragged into a harbour. And a guy goes at it with essentially a saw on the end of a big stick. Something that you might use for cutting down branches, say. And he sticks it into the side of the animal and he's working away, sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing, until he essentially pops what I presume is its stomach. And that little hole, that little incision he makes, is enough for the build-up of gases inside the whale to break through, and the whale literally explodes. Like, it fucking bursts open. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, you can look them up on YouTube. But the point being, any animal, when it dies, will inflate and will leak and it will burp and fart and presumably defecate and urinate and all the rest of it. Perfectly natural. That's just how it fucking goes. Which is fine in the wild, but not so fine when, you're laying a loved one to rest and they're laid out wherever it is, in the funeral parlour, or maybe your front room in your house, or their house, or wherever, you know, you don't want your loved one defecating or urinating or burping or farting for a whole host of reasons. And because of that, part of a funeral director's profession is preparing the body so that that doesn't happen. So I would imagine the body is drained somehow, and then the orifices, so your nostrils, your mouth, or your throat, say, presumably your ears too, maybe, and certainly your anus, vagina and penis, they're all clogged basically. So my understanding is the penis is literally tied. I presume there's some sort of a plug for the anus and the vagina and the throat and all the rest of it. Now these are details that I would love to know more about, because I have the gist, but I don't have the details. And I'm just an interested person. And the thought has come to mind that I would love to, again, love probably isn't the right word, but I would be very interested in being present for this process, to just understand it further and get a better understanding of the whole thing. And that guy that I mentioned, that I passed by his house not so long ago, I would know him by name, and I could very easily say, hey dude, I won't mention his name for whatever reason, hey dude, you know, and fill him in on what I was thinking, and would it be possible to be present during the procedure. Now, he's likely, I think, to say one of two things. A, how about no, you weirdo? Or B, yeah, no problem. Like, we do it all the time. Because for a lay person like myself, and presumably the overwhelming majority of people listening, death is this kind of weird thing that we kind of have to go through ourselves, and, you know, a certain amount of our loved ones are going to pass, especially the elderly, etc., etc. But we're very much out of that loop of preparing the body. Whereas a funeral director, they do it all the time. It's not only is it no big thing to them, it's like literally their livelihood. So he could very easily say, you know, how about no, weirdo? Or, yeah, but by all means, like, I mean, you know, presumably he wouldn't just let anybody in for a gawk, and that's certainly not what I want. It's not a nosiness, but I suppose depending on what way you define nosiness, maybe it is, but it's certainly out of interest. And it's got the brain spinning, it has me thinking. And one thing that cropped up was, I wouldn't want to know the name of the person. I certainly wouldn't want to know the person. I think both of those would be relatively disrespectful. Like, I'm not going to go to my uncle's funeral, or before I go to my uncle's funeral, I don't want to see him, you know, stripped naked and prepared. So it would have to be, I suppose, a stranger. And I wouldn't want to know the name of the person. And the reason that I wouldn't want to know the name of the person is because I suppose I wouldn't want to let it slip. Or not even let it slip, but... So, any loved one of mine that has passed away, I wouldn't like the idea of chatting to somebody and for them to say, oh yeah, I was at, you know, Brendan McGee's body preparation. I don't know, I wouldn't be comfortable with that. Again, my own knee-jerk would be, and maybe this is a shame against me, but my own knee-jerk would be, oh yeah, well, you went in for a gawk, did you? What do you like, weirdo? But if somebody was to say, I was actually present at the preparation of a body, I'd want to know more. I wouldn't want to know more if the person was referencing, you know, a fucking loved one of mine who had passed. So I suppose, provided I didn't know the person, and I know myself, I would keep it very vague if I was to ever talk about it in future. Like, you have to be, again, maybe this is just me, maybe I have a tendency to overthink things. But one thing that I could imagine myself saying or doing after the fact would be, I was at the preparation of a body for before they were buried. And if somebody asked me when, I'd say ages ago, last year. Because you don't want to say, oh, it was the 3rd of January 2018, it was an elderly woman with a big birthmark on her cheek. Because again, you're kind of giving away the person's identity. And it's funny that I care. And I do care. I wouldn't like to, I suppose I'd be afraid of being disrespectful. Now again, it's funny though, because to me, it cuts both ways. Like to me, when you die, your body is just a corpse. It may as well be a deer that died in a fucking forest. But I wouldn't say that about, somebody very close to me. So there's a weird kind of double standard. But look, nobody in their right mind would claim that everything is simple, especially in relation to death and the preparation of the body and whatever else. But I find it interesting. It's a loop that I'm completely out of. And it'd be an interesting conversation with the funeral director just to see what he'd say. Again, it could be, what's wrong with you? Oh my God. And he could go around telling everybody, your man Fran McKeown, you never guess what fucking he asked me. He asked, could he stick his big fucking nose into my business and some other person's fucking end of life or death preparation or whatever the term is. And here's another one for you. There's a girl from my area, Elizabeth Oakes, I think is her name. And she is a funeral director. I think I have that term. Is she a funeral director? She certainly takes in the bodies of people who have passed and prepares them for burial. But she is a peculiar take on it. I believe she was the first person to bring it into Ireland. And I've heard it called a couple of different terms. Water cremation or aqua cremation, I think, are the two most common. And it's, as the name suggests, it's similar to cremation. So instead of them preparing the body and then burying the body, with a cremation, they burn the body, you collect the ashes, and then you're free to bury the ashes or scatter the ashes. Interesting side note, I've also heard of a couple of different companies who have an interesting take on what to do with your ashes. One of them is they'll take your ashes and they'll mix it with compost, and they'll put a sapling tree into it and give you the tree basically. So you get to plant the tree, which has, some remnants of your loved one, at least in its root mass, and therefore in the tree itself. And I think there's something really cool about that. Another thing then is, or before I actually move on from that, there's a weirdness to that as well, because, what happens if the tree gets a fucking fungal infection and dies, or is struck by lightning or whatever. So there's at least when you scatter the ashes, you scatter them, it's done and dusted, pardon the pun. And nothing can really go wrong outside of the poor unfortunate people who I'm sure have, tipped the ashes out and the wind has blown it back in their face. I'm sure that's had to have happened. Some poor unfortunate. But anyway, so that's one creative way of, disposing of a body, or it's a fitting tribute, I think, to people. Another one then, a little bit more dramatic, is a company that will put your loved one's ashes into a big giant firework. And presumably the idea is you and your friends and family or whoever else go to that person's favourite place, set up the rocket, say a few words, light the candle, and fucking up she goes. Which is kind of, a spectacular end, I think, in a kind of a cool way, because in Ireland, funerals don't tend to be celebrations of the person's life. They tend to be quite somber occasions. Not all of them. An uncle of mine passed away a number of years ago, and his funeral was essentially like a wedding. They rented out a huge big room and had a full-on meal. Everyone was dressed. Now that we were dressed predominantly in black, as is the tradition in Ireland, but it was very much like a wedding. It really was a celebration of the man's life, and in the coolest way. It was certainly the best funeral I was ever at. Again, you know, words tend to fail me for describing things like this. Another unique and quite creative way is, I believe, a person's ashes can be compacted to such a degree that you can make diamonds out of them. Because a person's ashes, I would imagine, are predominantly made of carbon, and diamonds are exclusively made of carbon. So if you get a person's ashes and you compact them enough through whatever process, that can be kind of a fitting tribute. But again, like the tree one, you don't want to lose that diamond. Do you know that having something to remember the person by is kind of great, but you're running the risk of losing the fucking thing. And there's an element of a burden of responsibility there. And I know what I'm fucking talking about there, because I unfortunately lost my dad's wedding ring. I was wearing it, was going to wear it and give it, you know, till I died, and give it to my fucking son and pass it on, basically. But I lost 20 kilos. A certain amount of that 20 kilos came off my finger, and one day my ring just wasn't on my hand, and despite my best efforts, I never managed to retrieve it. And that sickens me on a daily basis ever since, and I think will continue to haunt me. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't do that. I used to rub the inside of my ring finger like that, just out of habit, and I still do it. And every time I do it now, there's no fucking ring there. Sometimes this is months and months later, sometimes I still kind of go, oh me, you know, oh fuck, where is it? Oh yeah, and then you're kind of reminded, no, you fucking lost the cunt thing. But anyway, getting back to Elizabeth Oakes. So I believe, as I said, that she brought water cremation to Ireland. And my understanding of water cremation is the body is placed in some sort of a metal container, a metal vat. The vat is filled with a mixture of water and I don't know what kind of chemicals. And heat and pressure is applied. And it essentially just completely, totally and utterly dissolves every single last part of you, with the exception of bone, things like fillings and implants, fake hips, things like that, and you're just left with the skeleton essentially. That skeleton then is crushed or pulverized, and that's the remains that you get to keep, scatter, make into a diamond, explode into a fucking firework, or grow into a tree, or whatever. She'd be another interesting girl. She'd be a great guest. Fucking hell. But it's funny that there's no conversation really around death. And I know the conversation that I'm having with myself here in the van out my deliveries is a very practical conversation. I haven't got into the spirituality of it and all the rest of it. That's for another podcast. And I have my own beliefs in that. Crudely summarised, when a person dies, I don't think the soul goes anywhere. I don't believe in heaven. I think when the lights go out, and you revert back to the state that you were in before you were born, essentially, which is effectively nothing. I'm not a fervent believer of these things. That's just my inclination. But I do like the idea of people living on. So I do like the idea that my dad lives on through me, and that I will live on through my kids, etc., etc. And it's not just a bloodline thing. I think that people live on through the people that they affected. So there's a guy who would have affected me quite profoundly, a guy called Christopher Hitchens, who's since passed away. I never met the man now. He was a kind of a public intellectual figure. I would like to think that he lives on, to some degree at least, within me, because of the effect that he had on me. And each to their own. I wouldn't say that anybody who believes in heaven, say, is wrong, or anybody who has divergent views on my way of thinking. I would never say that they are wrong. I would never say that I am right. It's just how I feel about it. And I think the benefit I get out of these monologues is that had I not recorded this, that would still be just rattling around in my head. Like, I've thought about this a good bit over the years. But maybe this recording is one step closer to me actually approaching either Elizabeth Oakes or that other funeral director. I'm not mentioning the other funeral director's name, and that's only because I said I'm only after passing by his house, and I don't know, I'm erring on the side of caution in relation to kind of privacy there. But that's what's rattling around the old dome today. And on that note, I'll chat to you soon.